And next up, in a showcase of exactly what they were both telling us, we are going to be in conversation with an SDG advocate and with some young activists as well. I think they're all coming to the front. So, without further ado, please welcome to the stage founder of Plus One Vote and a youth advocate on the official youth constituency of the UNFCCC, Saad Amir. A medical doctor, Canadian Meritorious Service Cross recipient, and a UN High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth, Dr. Ala Marabit. And last but not least, Brazilian virtual reality developer and psychology student, who's also the co-author of a mini documentary we'll hear more about, Guilherme Novak. Yeah. Now, with that spotty show of applause, we're going to do it again. Let us have a huge round of applause to welcome our panel. Okay. That's your one job, guys, so I need you to do it. All right, guys, welcome.
Hello, hello.
It's so exciting to have you up here. Guilherme, I actually want to start with you because you did a film that we want to hear a little bit about, and we haven't had a chance to play a trailer. So tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Guilherme, and I'm one of the co-authors of Cipó de Jabuti. Amazon Riverine Stories is a virtual reality mini documentary on the Amazon Riverine communities. I'm here joined by the other co-authors, who is Rafael Bittencourt, a photographer from Porto Alegre, and Odenilze Ramos, who is an Amazonian community leader. So,
what was her name? Sorry.
Odenilze Ramos.
Wonderful. I didn't mean to speak over you.
Yeah, so the documentary is about exactly what Mr. Deuda was talking about. It's about showing the world how those riverine communities in the Amazon live and what we can learn about them. There's a lot of about the SDGs that we can learn by living with those riverine communities. So we wanted to show that. Is our effort to show to the world, to the general public, what we can learn from these communities.
Yeah, bring new voices in. And it was actually one of the official selections for the My World 360 competition. So it's actually playing here. People can see it.
Yes.
Which is awesome. Now, Saad, as the founder of Plus One Vote, youth activism of this sort and just youth creativity to bring that perspective to the SDGs is something that we're excited to see. What else have you seen with your generation? I don't want to assume you two are the same generation, but I get that sense, that we can tap into.
You know, I think with my generation, there's this sort of refusal to compromise, right? I think traditionally when looking at policy, when looking at politics across the world, we kind of come across a lot of mediocrity. You know, we see these leaders that go out and they make these big speeches and they kind of have these plans, but time after time, administration after administration, we fail to see any actual action. And so the youth now, we're all looking, all eyes are on the leaders of the world. And we have the power of the media, we have the power of our own voices, of our votes, to kind of collect them together and mobilize in a way that holds these people accountable. And in that way, and I think only in that way, we can finally start working toward the SDGs, towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
And tell us a little bit about Plus One Vote for folks who don't know the organization.
Of course. So my organization, Plus One Vote, it is a nonprofit based here in the United States. And the idea is when you go to vote, bring a plus one with you. And the whole concept kind of started from this idea of we need to improve representation in the United States.
Is that a party invite concept you've turned into activism?
Basically, it's just one big party at the polls, like, you know how it is.
That is very millennial and awesome. Carry on.
No, for sure. And you know, and that's the thing. I think voting is sort of this sort of thing that's presented as your civic duty, and you have to do this, and it seems like this very big responsibility, and it is. But at the same time, I think it's your way to express your voice. It's your way to let your officials know what you believe in. And we do a lot of issue-based campaigning. And so we're about to launch a campaign on climate change because that's, for me, the biggest issue that I think that our generation is facing, the biggest issue the world will be facing in the coming years. And
it's a survival issue.
It is a survival issue, and it is a voting issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Ala, you're an SDG advocate, which is wonderful. And there were a whole new class of SDG advocates joining the group this year that the Secretary General just announced. I wonder, from your experience in seeing the new class and then being here with the younger generation, what do you feel most excited about in the year ahead and in the decade ahead as we approach 2030?
So we have 17 Sustainable Development Goal advocates, and we have 5 of our original 17 who became alumni, and we've invited 5 new ones into the SDG Advocate community, which is great. And one of the main reasons we did that was to actually have younger advocates. When I became an advocate a few years ago, I was the youngest at 25, and the unfortunate reality is Eddie and I are still the 2 youngest and only ones under 30. And one of the major kind of needs we have when we talk about the SDG advocates and when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals in general is being able to relay policy issues as well as activism and engagement into something more tangible. I think everybody here can agree it is wonderful for us to talk about the SDGs. It's wonderful for us to gather in spaces like this. But the fundamental reality is we are actually quite far behind, and we will not meet the 2030 deadline. We probably won't meet a 2050 deadline.
Absolutely. And the data all tells us that, right? We're off track.
Well, the data tells
More
us
than
that,
off track.
But you can just turn on the news. You don't even need data to tell you. Like, just go outside. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges, especially when we're talking about climate and health, is a recognition that each of the Sustainable Development Goals on their own is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge.
Yeah.
Climate change is a threat multiplier. That means that we are going to see a lot more health pandemics. We're going to see a lot more, when it comes to the exclusion of populations, particularly indigenous populations, we're going to see a lot more of that. We are going to see more stress and negative attention towards the inclusion of women, women's reproductive rights. We're going to see a lot more engagement around girls' education, both in the positive and negative. Those are fundamental realities of what climate does, but also what our global political system looks like. And until we start connecting climate to the much bigger framework of the SDGs and start pointing out that the single most cost-effective and practical solution to climate change is not sexy new rockets or cool technologies, but it's girls' education and women's reproductive rights, we're a huge step behind. We're a huge step behind. We keep looking for these quick, exciting fixes where we spend a lot of money and we have a huge show, and we're missing the very basics. We're missing talking to local communities, recognizing Indigenous actors as architects and leaders in the climate change movement, and recognizing the importance of inclusion, and particularly of girls' education and women's reproductive rights.
So in the mode that we're in right now, because to your point, there are these moments that we have where we see a surge of excitement and interest, and we see the tent getting bigger, literally, toward inclusion. But it's also true, and you're right, that we all intuitively recognize we're not only not on track, we're way, way off track, and yet we have to stay motivated. So how do we encourage people to get engaged in this fight and not lose the momentum because they feel so daunted by the task we have ahead of us? Jeremy, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. That's a very tough question.
Yeah, actually. I know. That's my job.
But I think we kind of aimed at when making Cipó de Jabuti, because on the mini documentary, you actually are presented to those riverine communities, and at the end, you are invited to join them with community-based tourism. So you are invited to participate with their local communities and so on. So it's a way to engage people in a more positive way, to get to know them.
Why did you choose to do that? What was the impetus for it?
Yeah, we actually, when we arrived in the Amazon and studied and lived with those local communities for a few days, we actually saw that there was a lot of positive things to be told about them, that they can tell us, actually, right? So we just reported that, and there's actually kind of an inverse bias, because when we talk about the Amazon, we are generally talking about the challenges, and this is very important, in fact, but also a way to perhaps, I think it's also important to show the positive ways in which people can interact with the Amazon, can interact with the climate in a fun and more positive way and intriguing way that really engages people.
And
I
why
think it's
VR?
also,
go ahead.
sorry. It's like your process of your organization, like inviting people to look at looking at this process in a new perspective, an engaging perspective.
Absolutely. the interesting thing, though, is that people think of this as a huge barrier to entry, right? When you say, I want to make a VR film, that sounds like Eddie Ndopu, who I meant to point out. Ala mentioned Eddie, the other youngest SDG advocate. That's Eddie Ndopu, who's a disabilities advocate and hopes to be the first disabled American in space. Am I getting that right? But the interesting thing here is that you're actually, it's hard to get across that bridge. We can always say, you could make a film, you could start an organization, but generally people don't think of themselves as able to do that. And I guess that's the interesting question to me. Why did you, not rather how do we, give us that sort of inside story of how you got yourself over that hump to go start an organization. Is that just who you guys are?
I think for me, it was sort of, when we're looking at an issue like climate change, and you realize, for me, I realize how intersectional this issue is, right? It's not just, oh, the ocean's going to rise an inch or two or whatever. It's, okay, well, this is going to cause ripple effects across the entire world. This is causing burning down of forests all across California in record wildfires. It's causing flooding in the Midwest of the United States. It's costing billions of dollars to even my home community on Long Island from Hurricane Sandy in 2012, still to this day. And, when I was looking at this issue and the impacts that it's going to have on our global society, 200 million, at least, climate refugees projected by 2050. Women and girls who are not going to be able to get education or who are currently not getting their education. The acidification of our oceans and the destruction of species across the world. When I looked at this issue dead in the eyes, and I think it's important that we look at these issues dead in the eyes and that we don't look away, then there was nothing I could do other than take action. So when I started to really feel what these issues meant, how they were impacting not only me, my society, and my community, but people across the world, I started talking to my friends about it.
Yeah.
My organization is, like you said, it's kind of a party.
A voting party.
It's a voting party. And it's sort of about having those conversations at first and really understanding what are the people around you passionate about? What are you passionate about? And I think once you start developing your own passions, then you'll really surprise yourself of what you can grow that from being an individual to just something big with a whole movement and force of community around you and your ideas.
And it is this balance between facing the challenge, recognizing that it's difficult, and also recognizing that you have agency. You are a person with agency, and so many tools and partners and potential resources at your disposal. Now, Ala, you are a bit further along in your sustainable development journey than these guys, as you said, having been an SDG advocate up to this point. And I think you have an incredible perspective on how leaders up the chain see a lot of this activism. How do you think we can trickle up some of this energy and the energy we saw from Greta this morning into actually making a tangible impact on how leaders operate and address these issues?
So I'm going to touch on the first question because it'll tie into the answer to this one, which is how do people get engaged and why are we here? And I think we need to overemphasize the importance of privilege. We all had the privilege of a good education. We all had the privilege, regardless of where we lived or whatever, of a potentially supportive family or community, maybe friends. We all had the privilege of being able to access information easily. We all had the privilege of feeling comfortable enough in life to go out and say, okay, what does the world need? The vast majority of the world does not have that privilege. If you're talking to a young girl who does not know if she has healthcare services, or a young boy who is in the middle of a conflict zone and is being pulled into conflict because of how lucrative and how powerful it is, they don't have the privilege. So no one up here, and this is, not to be offensive, but no one here at all is exceptional. We are incredibly privileged. That is what it comes down to. And I think with that privilege comes a lot of responsibility and accountability. We're all in this room talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. What ultimately does that mean?
Yes.
When I was 21, I started an organization in Libya on the inclusion of women in conflict and peace processes. And the main reason I did that was because I felt like with women's inclusion, and statistically with women's inclusion, peace would be a lot more sustainable and possible. Now, between 2011 and today, has the conversation there really changed? Not much. It really hasn't. Youth engagement and activism is fantastic. Marching is fantastic. Protests are fantastic. Increasing awareness is fantastic. But if every single time you march up to a closed door and nothing changes, then nothing is going to change.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our political system is not held to the same level of accountability in that way as we need it to be. We don't have those mechanisms in place.
So what do we do?
I think
And
first and
that's a
foremost
question for all three of you.
is I don't think young people should be only marching. I think young people should run.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's this kind of false dichotomy of you are either an activist on the streets or you're a policymaker in the building, and you can be both, and you should be both. I think we need more people who are actively passionate and engaged in the Sustainable Development Goals to be in the rooms making the decisions, and not even the Sustainable Development Goals. You might not even know what they are or care what they are, but if you fundamentally believe climate change is a issue in your community, then run for office. It's great to vote, but as far as I've seen, we don't seem to be getting the right people in power. So run.
You can clap for that. And you guys, what do you think needs to happen so that some of these mechanisms that we just take for granted as barriers for life actually change? This is the younger generation. Neither one are like you first. Go ahead, Jeremy, and then we'll come back this way.
Very quickly, actually. So I agree very much with you that we have to reckon, especially my immense privilege on being here, or having a quality education and so on. And with that privilege, I think I'm trying to do a little bit of what you told earlier. You know about all those space and rock and space and new technologies that are getting much more attention from the world. So I think when we start studying about them, it's a way to use the privilege to democratize the access of them, and also provide good examples on how we can develop these technologies. These technologies such as fourth revolution technologies, fourth industrial revolution technologies as a whole, set of technologies, right? So I think that's a way that we can grab our privilege, reckon that we have it, and develop something that truly gets more impact than average.
It's a means of passing your privilege along,
Exactly.
right? But that takes awareness of your privilege.
Yes.
To be able to say, I'm a man, I'm educated, I am all these things, I have access to these resources, and then actively try to transfer them in as much as that's possible to other people who don't have that access. And what about you, San? You were going to say.
And I agree. I think, this is a very privileged group. Politicians are very privileged people. And I think that there's this fundamental lack of understanding of what the other side of that looks like. I think a lot of policymakers have never been poor. They've never met poor people or people of the various minorities that they're supposedly representing. And so when I look at sort of governments, I feel like there's a large need for systematic change. And when people start advocating for changes in the way that we value currency or value success or the ways that we are sort of pushing our society forward in terms of gender equality or issues on climate, we need radical change across the board, you know? And people look at this word radical and they sort of tack into that, right? People are like, oh, that's too radical. That'll never pass. We could never implement that sort of change.
It's not electable.
It's not electable. I won't get in office again. And when I look at that and I see these leaders that are just not willing to lead, why are they even there? Who hired you?
We hired them.
And that's the thing is, in the same way we hired them, we can also change that reality. And in addition, when we talk about radical, I think the radicals are kind of like, oh, universal health care, climate action, gender equality, these things that are actually good. And then, you look at the other side and it's like, well, what to me is radical is that we're now in a world that is so embedded and obsessed with corporate profit and corporate money that is the only priority that we have, that we would rather fund fossil fuel companies than fund the communities that are currently facing the impacts of hurricanes in the Pacific.
Do you think that we are actually at an inflection point? I feel like every generation thinks this is the moment everything changes, right? And we've heard that with the climate strike on Friday. It was like, we've never seen this before. And of course, we have actually seen huge movements before. But this feels, people, and I've heard this constantly, people feel like something special is going on that hasn't happened. And part of it may be in reaction to what has happened globally, politically, and us all realizing that being complacent has resulted in some things that maybe aren't so great and we wouldn't have wanted or chosen had we been thinking about it or seen them coming. But what do you think is there anything special about this moment? Do you feel something different happening? And Ala, maybe I want to start with you because you've been there, and I think you're also very aware of how a lot of what we talk about in this room doesn't necessarily translate out into the world, the real world.
I actually don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to be the Debbie Downer in the room, I don't.
No, be that.
I don't think this is a unique moment in time in any particular way. I think we're seeing a lot of engagement around climate change. We saw that a couple of years ago around gender. And then we have what media calls the backlash. I think that what we're actually seeing, if anything, is a huge resurgence of authoritarianism and nationalism. That's what we're tangibly seeing. It's great to march, but who's getting elected?
Yeah.
Who's getting voted into office? Who's in charge of your budgets? Who's in charge of your policies? And it's definitely not the same people marching for climate change. So if anything, I actually think, I mean, what we're seeing is a significant amount of division in people's understanding of policies and the environment. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of people who feel unheard on both sides, saying that we're going to speak up and we're going to speak louder, and we're going to continue to see that. This doesn't go away.
Yeah.
I mean, history is, if anything, doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it's definitely cyclical. And we've seen all of this before, and it will happen again. And so the same way that, the 1960s were the decade of the women, and then 1992 was the year of the woman, and then 2018 was the year of the woman, and somehow we're still paid, for minority women in this country are still paid half of what a white man is paid. And that's in the United States of America, and it's getting worse. If we look at maternal mortality, the United States is the only country in the world, the only developed country where it's declining, where it's rising. Maternal mortality rates are rising. If you are a black woman in New York, you are 12 times more likely to die than a white woman from childbirth and childbirth complications. These are things that are getting worse, not better. So I can get very excited, and I am excited by seeing people engaged and people, but we have to remember that there's two key things I will say. We have to remember that a lot of people are getting engaged and passionate because there's a lot more information out there.
Yes, absolutely.
But information also travels a lot quicker. So it's one thing and then the next, right? We don't necessarily have the sustained momentum, I believe, for us to be able to make the changes we need to make, as it is now. The second thing is climate is a relatively easier issue to get engaged on. It doesn't demand that you look at your own biases. It doesn't demand that you start to assess what you're doing as much. It's very easy to blame climate on the corporations or on the government. It's not like looking at something like reducing inequalities or gender equality or poverty. It's really not. It's a lot easier for us to say, yeah, I'm a climate champion. Okay, when I tell you that women's reproductive rights is essential, why are we still talking about rockets? Like, let's be genuinely honest with ourselves. Even within the progressive movement, there are easier things for us to talk about. The fundamental reality is climate is underpinned by racial and social and gender inequalities at every level. And if we really want to start talking about shifting political systems, and we want to talk about money and politics, you have to talk about a capitalistic system that does have certain countries benefiting more than others.
But to your point, actually, for that exact reason, climate is, you can clap for that, climate is underpinned by bias, right? Because even the people who say that they're engaged on climate, when you bring up those points, that's a completely different conversation.
It's a completely different conversation, but it's also similar. I'll give you an example. We've talked a lot about women's inclusion in peace processes. That's one of the things I focus on. And you'll have countries that say, we have a feminist foreign policy. And then they will be the same countries that have the largest arms sales.
Right.
Those two things cannot mix. I'm sorry, but we have to start demanding accountability from ourselves. We actually are in the rooms. We get to start saying, hey, wait a second. That relationship doesn't make sense. So if we're talking about climate, and on one hand you say, I fundamentally believe in climate change, and on the other you're saying, listen, I'm not going to invest in girls' education, I'm not going to invest in women's reproductive rights, then sorry, anything you've said to me about climate is fundamentally irrelevant. Because we can support and we can invest in small live crop owners. We can talk about the ecosystems. We can talk about the reefs. We can do all of that. We can talk about ecotourism. We can do all of that. But fundamentally, what we need to do, statistically, empirically, financially, is recognize that climate change is an inherently human problem with inherently human solutions, and we have to start talking about sensitive issues like where are Indigenous voices in this conversation, what are we doing for women and girls around the world, how are we talking about racial and wealth inequality, what are we actually talking about when it's climate change? What are we actually doing?
I want to come back to you two because you're right? I had to ask that question about the inflection point because I think you're right that we're not there, and yet we eventually have to get there, right? We can't, just because we don't think we can achieve a goal doesn't mean we stop. And so I wonder if you two could reflect a little bit on, as we close up, how we turn this into something more than it seems like it is right now. How do we take this energy and the urgency of the problems that we're facing, which are real, and take the fact that people who are imperfect allies, certainly, are more engaged in this than they have ever been, and they're also being pushed by their constituents in ways, and they can be pushed by their constituents because of the technologies and the amplification that we have right now. How do we take all of those things together, all of those vectors, and turn them into an actual moment, into something that 100 years from now we look back and we say it happened right then in 2020. The decade of action actually started then.
I think part of this is we need to change how we're having these conversations, right? Like climate change, we think go green, save the turtles, this sort of thing, and it's true, we should save the turtles.
Yes, do save the turtles, but also that's not it.
Yes,
that's not everything.
There's a lot more to it, and it's so intersectional across the board that we need people to understand that. And when we're looking at these sort of imperfect allies, and we're seeing these sort of corporations starting to make sort of disingenuous efforts in the SDG space. To me, they often seem disingenuous. They seem, we're going to have all this good media because there's all of these woke millennials out there who want to see traction on this. They want to see some sort of corporate efforts. And so we're going to do this small thing, and that's going to get us a good press. We're going to make more sales. We're going to make more money than even we're investing in the project itself.
Yes.
But I do think that to me offers some sort of hope, right? Because it shows at the very least that there's an acknowledgement of these corporations looking at these issues first. Second is if we're looking at, we're blah, blah, blah corporation, we're promising to make a 10% reduction in greenhouse gases, let's just say. I think we need to flip that conversation and say, okay, so you acknowledge the problem, you acknowledge that you have the funding and the ability to do this, but now you have 90% of your emissions staying exactly the same.
Right. That's the wrong way around.
Yes. And so you flip that conversation on them, you flip that paradigm, and that's where you got them. And from there, you hold them accountable. From there, you change their sales, you change your votes, you change your actions to reflect your beliefs, and then those institutions will start to change over time.
More than that, the social goodwill moves, right? Because so much of what we see in the research is that these things don't move because everybody suddenly believes something different. It's because a certain number of people believe something different and it becomes socially unacceptable for everybody else to stay in their old camp. And then everything starts to change because it has to. So I love this idea of sort of just pushing them in the right direction and pointing out 10% is not enough. 90% is the minimum, really. And Jeremy, I'm going to give you the last word before I do a little time check with my organizers here.
And in addition to that, I was also thinking about what you said, that climate change is an issue that is very interconnected with many other inequalities that we face today. And perhaps one thing that I'm personally seeing that is happening is a lot of young activists using technology to try and promote empathy regarding many of these equalities, such as gender, race, and financial inequalities, and so on. So maybe in addition to that, to getting the info on the most effective way and holding accountable in a truly conscious way, trying to promote empathy to lessen the divisions that we hold on our societies today. So I do believe technology, when well used, when consciously and responsibly used, can do that.
And that is a human solution, right? Because all the research also shows us that when people know stories, when they connect not just on the basis of charts and statistics, but true human stories, that changes minds as well, changes minds and hearts. So I just want to take a last word. This will be a lightning round from each of you. 15 to 30 seconds. What's the number one thing people in this room and watching out there can do to have an effect on this conversation we've just been having?
All right. There's a lot of new technologies that are growing today. These are exponentially growing, and maybe it's important for us to take our place as protagonists younger generations also as protagonists on making and developing those technologies in a more responsible way, because they will surely impact our societies from now on.
I love the activeness of that. You are a protagonist in this conversation, so do something with it. Ala?
I don't think that you need to start an organization or become a commissioner, or I think that when we look at the data, problems are inherently local. And solutions are inherently local, and that's something that I do think we need to talk about more in the Sustainable Development Goals. So the first thing I would say is look at your own power and look at the space you occupy and who you have influence and privilege over in the spaces you do. That might be your school, it might be your local church, it might be your local organization, and start saying, what can I do to ensure other voices that have been excluded from this conversation are heard? So who's not in the room, and how do I leverage my own credibility, my own resources, my own influence, and my own power to ensure somebody else has that? The second thing I would say is start talking to strangers.
Yes.
Have super uncomfortable conversations about the issues that matter, because everybody in this room agrees climate change is an incredibly important issue. If you go 2 blocks down, you're going to find people who don't.
Yeah.
And it's great to have us preaching to the choir all the time, but it's so much more important for us to start talking to strangers and trying to understand, where is the challenge? What are we not seeing? When we talk about something like girls' education, where is the resistance coming from? Because oftentimes that's learned behavior that will take generations to unlearn. And I don't necessarily think it's just a moment. It's great to start, but we have the privilege of calling this a moment. For people around the world, this is the daily reality of their life. And if we don't start having these conversations now, we're going to continue to put Band-Aid solutions on problems that genuinely need to actually be investigated and taken care of more holistically.
And as people in this room and in this conversation, you actually have more power than most to change minds. And what's the worst that can happen? You get off the elevator, you cross the street, you get out of the train, right? But it's something that, again, 30 years from now, that person that you touch, even one person, can point to that moment and say, that's when I realized I was wrong on this. And the movement grows that way.
Or you learn how to say something differently that actually engages people who disagree with you.
Yeah.
It works wonderfully. You can actually
Conversation.
Yeah, you can learn what the pinpoints are and where a lot of the challenges, and actually translating a lot of these conversations into tangible policy and changing hearts. And so you might not change anybody's mind, but you might walk away saying, I'm a lot more equipped to have difficult conversations on a myriad of issues.
But what I find fascinating, I always talk about taking the Kobe approach to this. As a basketball player, he took a zillion shots, and at some point, some huge ones have to land, right? Because you need to have the energy to carry that conversation forward. Nobody wants to have 100,000 conversations that all end in somebody angry at you. And you have to trust that you are right on this, because we know that you are, and you have to trust that somebody on the other end of that conversation at some point, even if it's one person, is going to hear you, and that person's going to go have more conversations like that, and then this grows exponentially, and we change this entire thing. Because otherwise, what are we doing here, right? You have got to believe, because if you don't believe, there's no hope of achieving this agenda in 2030 or 2130 or anywhere beyond. And with that, Saad, how do we fix this? You tell me. Last word.
Vote.
That was definitely under 15
Right?
seconds.
For me, and I think it goes to your point about conversations. I think it's so much about engaging the people around you and understanding that even the people that are in your inner circle probably don't think about things the same way that you do. When I was starting all of this, I found that my smart friends, my woke friends, my really educated friends were
How much do you like these people?
they were not registered to vote, or that they didn't understand what climate change was, or they didn't understand, how many men in my life are still uncomfortable talking about periods, Just these very simple day-to-day things that people just don't know and don't engage with because maybe they feel like there's some sort of taboo around it, or the people who are talking about it don't feel like bringing those conversations home into their communities.
Yeah.
And I think we have to change that.
Yeah.
If you feel something and you believe in something, make sure that the people around you know.
Yeah.
Because that's how you get everyone to believe with you.
Yes. Wonderful. We have a huge round of applause for our panel. They're incredible. Please check out Guilherme's film. Remind us the name again.
Guilherme.
No, I know your name. The name of your film.
Oh, it's SDG Jabuti. I think it will be screened right there,
Yeah,
right?
it is screening right now back there.
Virtual reality.
Wonderful. Dr. Ala Murabit is an SDG advocate, an amazing everything. And you can follow her and find more about her work everywhere here. And Sada Mer, where can we go for Plus One vote?
You can go to plus1campaign.org, or you can follow me on Instagram at It's Sadamir.
At Sadamir. Spell it.
ITSSAADAMER.
Wonderful. And they'll be here with us hanging out in the SDG Action Zone. Huge round of applause. Do we get to take a little break, guys? Or are we going right into the next session? Wonderful. Go for it. I love it that you stayed. How are we doing? How was this morning conversation? Morning of conversation. I have to say that I love all the themes that emerge over a week like this, but one of the ones that I've already seen coming out is that everything is activism. Everything in your life can be activism. Art, voting, being at the UN, chatting with your friends, and I want you to take that spirit into the afternoon and from there and beyond. But before we get into the next run of programming, I've heard that there are sandwiches and some grab-and-go things in the tent next door, so feel free to stop by and see if there's tea and coffee and things for you. And we'll be back in just a few minutes with the next bit of the program. And talk to each other, please. Yay!